Microsoft has long supported application database development with features built into Visual Studio, ranging from support for data access to the ability to create a connection to a database and manipulate database objects and data in simple ways. Various add-ons over the years have expanded these basic abilities. But even developers were constantly having to bounce between Visual Studio and either Enterprise Manager in earlier versions of SQL Server or Management Studio in more recent versions, including SQL Server 2012, in order to perform data-related tasks, such as to create database tables, set security features, or execute stored procedures. Neither Visual Studio nor the SQL Server tools fully supported database development. Then, several years ago, Microsoft released its first version of the Team System Edition of Visual Studio 2008. This was a huge package of group software collaboration tools, including a long overdue successor to its Visual SourceSafe source code control product. Over time, Team System spawned architecture, testing, and development editions. But for a long time, a piece was missing: a database edition. Microsoft soon rectified that and released the product codename DataDude. Officially, it's Visual Studio 2008 Team System Database Edition. Definitely a case where the codename was way cooler than the official name. DataDude, the Database Edition, was a set of tools for managing the full database development lifecycle. Software developers were intimately familiar with the process, since it mirrors the code, build, deploy, rinse, repeat cycle common in software development. And it can handle agile development methodologies as well. Database administrators had to get used to some things, but could most certainly be part of the process. Now, Microsoft had several important high-level goals for the product. First, they wanted to provide integrated change management, just like source control systems. This lets you go back in time to earlier versions of the database project and also provides controlled access to the project components to various developers for collaborative, simultaneous development. Another goal was to be able to manage database projects by allowing you to monitor progress and perform code reviews. They wanted you to be able to find and understand differences between versions. This way, you can easily find the differences that cause problems in order to resolve them quickly. You can also make changes and see their effectiveness without necessarily needing to build an entire project. It also supports isolated development environments so that each developer can work on their part of the project and test the changes before checking them in and distributing them to the rest of the team. They also wanted to allow for test solutions in order to validate the design and the code. You can use Team System support for unit tests to make sure that the design, code, and data doesn't introduce any breaking changes. The tools also simplify deployment of both the entire database and just changes to it. This supports a variety of deployment scenarios during development and after the database goes into production, including finding the changes made to a test version of the database relative to a production version of that database. And finally, they wanted to facilitate collaborative development of databases so that team members can work together productively. Database Edition was a huge step forward to make the process of creating database projects similar to creating application projects, particularly with its collaboration tools, support for source control, and test integration. But even with this edition, things just weren't as deeply integrated as they could be, in three primary ways. First, Developer Edition wasn't fully integrated with the database server. It enabled developers to perform more database-specific actions than earlier tools, but you still had to pop over to Management Studio way too often. Second, database developers had one tool to create database objects and another tool, the Business Intelligence Development Studio, or BIDS, for BI projects, adding a significant third tool to the mix in addition to Visual Studio and Management Studio. And third, Developer Edition made many things very easy. But once you went past simple stuff, things got pretty hard. This is a rather subjective assessment, I realize that, but there just seemed to be too many workarounds for what really should have been easy. The database edition was a great set of tools, particularly relative to what came before it. But with SQL Server 2012, Microsoft introduced what has so far proven to be the best set of tools yet, truly integrating database development tools into Visual Studio 2010 and 2012. In the SQL Server Data Tools documentation, Microsoft describes the product this way, quote, SQL Server Data Tools transforms database development by introducing a ubiquitous declarative model that spans all the phases of database development and maintenance update inside Visual Studio. You can use Data Tools' Transact SQL design capabilities to build, debug, maintain, and refactor databases. You can work with a database project or directly with a connected database instance on or off premise. End quote. That's a pretty apt description, as well as being very ambitious. The recurring theme is that Microsoft wanted to create an environment in which developers can create databases and database objects using the same tools they use for software applications. Data Tools also provides the environment in SQL Server 2012 for developing business intelligence projects, integration services packages, analysis services cubes, and reporting services reports, as well as other things related to these BI projects. My focus in this course is going to be on using Data Tools to work with objects in the core SQL Server database engine. Microsoft has thoroughly integrated all of the Data Tools features into Visual Studio 2010 and 2012 by including options in menus and various windows, including database-related project templates, and by making database development tasks work just like their software equivalents. Once you install the Data Tools, you create a new project just like any other Visual Studio or .NET project type, and add items such as tables or stored procedures by adding items to the database project. Then you can build the project, which generates various scripts, and deploy the database, all from within Visual Studio. SQL Server Data Tools takes full advantage of Visual Studio's extensibility features to make this process seamless within the development environment. One of the biggest advantages of Data Tools is that individual developers can develop database components locally and test them on a local instance of the database. Once a new feature is working satisfactorily, the developer can update source control with the changes and deploy the database to a test or production server, again, all from within Visual Studio. So there's a number of tasks that you can perform with Data Tools in Visual Studio. You can import and compare database schemas. You can track dependencies and discover breaking changes as soon as possible. You can refactor a database and its objects, and you can create, validate, and run build scripts. You can write and execute database scripts to create any kind of database object. You can publish a new database or changes to an existing database using a process very similar to deploying a software application. You can debug your T-SQL or SQL CLR code, and a lot more. Now, before I proceed any further, I want to make a note that you'll not want to use the version installed with the SQL Server 2012 installation programs, because updated versions since SQL Server 2012 was released to manufacturing have more functionality. So you'll want to make sure that you download and get the latest version that Microsoft has provided. Now, you can use the tools with either Visual Studio 2010 or 2012, but in this course, I'm basing everything on the version installed in Visual Studio 2012. With SQL Server Data Tools installed, Visual Studio has a new SQL Server Object Explorer window. This has many of the same features of Object Explorer in Management Studio. Without leaving Visual Studio, you can perform database administration and design work on any instance of SQL Server that you have access to, locally or remotely across the network. You can create and modify database objects, including tables, stored procedures, and user-defined functions, edit table data, compare schemas, execute code modules, and much more. Object Explorer even has support for script as options, so you can have the tools automatically generate T-SQL to create and modify database objects. So if I want to explore a particular instance of SQL Server, I can drill down here into SQL Server, and I have a connection here to an instance on my local machine, and I can drill down and see databases, security objects, and so forth. Now the nice thing here is that once you get used to working with the window, you'll probably find that you need to switch back and forth between Visual Studio and Management Studio far less than was necessary with earlier versions of the tools. And if you've developed software applications using Visual Studio, you'll probably feel right at home developing databases using data tools. You'll find all the same support for T-SQL as for .NET languages, including code navigation and IntelliSense, which, by the way, is implemented far more robustly than in Management Studio, and syntax validation, debugging, and support for code editing. You'll also find that Data Tools includes features that let you create objects directly using T-SQL code in an editor or graphically using designers. And it has full support for using version control for database object artifacts that you create within a project. DBAs are probably going to want to stick to Management Studio for their daily work with databases and SQL servers. But developers, particularly seasoned Visual Studio developers, will be able to completely live in Data Tools, except when you put on your DBA hat, as all of us probably often do, particularly for smaller clients that don't have full-time DBAs. The crux of the matter is that for simple admin tasks, you can use the new dedicated SQL Server Object Explorer and do most of what you need to do, from a developer's perspective, instead of using Management Studio. And when you create a new database project, you can act as though it were a new software project, a nifty abstraction from one context to another. Most of the database development work you'll do with the SQL Server Data Tools will be within the Editors, Designers, and Object Explorer window in Visual Studio. But some functions are supported by a command line tool, SQLpackage.exe, which you can use directly if you want to. SQL Package supports Data Tier Applications, or DAX, which provides support for deployment, management, and upgrading of database applications. A DAC is a single unit of deployment that contains all database objects, logins, and other instance-level objects, as well as deployment requirements, such as to require a minimum version of SQL Server to support the DAX features. With SQL Package, you can extract, export, import, and publish DAX using a variety of options. The command line interface can be daunting. The list of options with only the briefest of descriptions goes on for more than a couple dozen pages in the documentation, but you have a lot of flexibility when working with DAX. Now, one note of caution. The documentation for SQL Server Data Tools includes a topic called Using MS Deploy with DB SQL Package Provider, and it discusses a DB SQL Package.exe command line tool. This tool is an MS Deploy provider that interacts with both SQL Server and SQL Azure databases. You can use it to extract a database snapshot from an existing database, publish incremental changes to a database, create a report of changes that would be made by a publish action, and create a script for the changes. But, and here's the but, according to the documentation, DB SQL Package is deprecated and, quote, will be removed from the next major release of Visual Studio, end quote. The documentation doesn't make it clear, but Visual Studio 2012 is apparently that next major version. The features are now part of database publishing with Web Deploy, which is a topic outside the scope of this course. An important thing to talk about anytime you're dealing with databases and database objects is security. SQL Server Data Tools doesn't provide an end run around security. If you're working with a local copy of the database during development, you probably have administrative rights in that instance of SQL Server. But in order to deploy a database or changes to a test or production server, you'll need the appropriate permissions to take those actions on that server. And the permissions you need may depend on the version of SQL Server that the remote server is running. The required permissions for SQL Server Data Tools documentation topic has most of the security details you need. For example, it shouldn't come as a surprise that if you want to create a database using a SQL Server Data Tools project, you either need the Create Database permission or be a member of the DB Creator role in that server instance. If you want to update database objects, you'll need to be a valid database user as well as be a member of the DB DDL admin role, own the object schema, or own the objects directly. There are nearly infinite ways to configure permissions and security in a database, so my configuration is highly unlikely to be anything like yours. In this course, I'm going to assume that you have all the required permissions to perform actions on the database, so that we don't get bogged down in security details and can focus on showing you what data tools can do. Fortunately, most of the times the error you get when you lack permissions to perform an action will clearly explain the problem. So you should be able to easily resolve the problem, either by arranging to have the missing permission granted to you or by packaging up the project for deployment by someone who has the required permissions. There are two ways to use SQL Server Data Tools, connected and offline. All right, so the first is connected development. You might call this Management Studio mode. With a live connection to the database server, local or remote, you can make direct changes to database objects that take effect immediately. This mode works with any database server, including SQL Azure. And in fact, a big motivation for Microsoft to develop the data tools was driven in part by the need to develop database projects for Azure. This mode of development is similar to using Management Studio to make changes to database objects and data. You're making the changes directly on the objects. And then the other mode is offline development. And Microsoft calls this, quote, project-oriented offline database development, which is more than a mouthful. I prefer to call this the software approach to database development, at least in the Visual Studio world of development. But this is, in fact, offline development in the sense that you don't have to have a connection to a SQL Server instance to create databases and objects or update them. When you're ready to deploy the changes, what Data Tools calls publishing the changes, you'll find that Data Tools has a slew of tools for updating a database, comparing schemas and data, and perform other functions that let you work offline. And of course, there are plenty of team-based features that support collaborative development, particularly in offline mode, including unit testing and placing code modules in the version control system of your choice.